One of the most important moments in the Hebrew Scriptures comes in this little sort of throwaway story near the start of the story of Samuel. The Hebrew people lose in a battle to the Philistines, and then they try again, and then they lose again. But I want to argue that this very idea that the God of the Hebrew people is willing to lose a battle even when that God's reputation is on the line is actually a formational idea in the identity of the Hebrew people and in their conception of who their God is, but also is really important for us, for Christians, to look back through the Hebrew Scriptures, understanding that the willingness of God to look the fool, like God does on the cross, the humiliation of that moment, to do what is right, even at the cost of God's reputation, this is actually a fundamental, foundational characteristic of who this God is, one that leads us to understand the sacrifice of Jesus in a really powerful way.
There's a sort of conspicuous repetition. Let us bring to us. There's this sort of implication that they think of God's presence as something they can wield against their enemies here. And that would not be particularly surprising as a posture for an ancient military. In fact, fetishizing gods into war talismans was sort of de rigueur for the time. I mean, that's what all their enemies would have been doing. So why not them? Let's bring God with us. How can we possibly lose? Except, it doesn't work. Round two, they bring the ark with them. It's actually Eli's scoundrel sons from last week that bring it. Everyone gets excited. The battle re-engages. The Philistines rout the Israelites, and they win. And this time, they head home with the Ark of Covenant in tow. Actually, it gets worse than that. Because during the battle, Eli's two sons are killed, and when a messenger runs to tell him the news, he falls back in his chair, breaks his neck, dies on the spot, leaving Israel without a leader. And all of that happens in less than a chapter, by the way. But this is also why that earlier conversation about God not playing by our rules was important. Because one of the assumptions of the ancient world was that the gods operated on the same kind of shame and honor valuations that we do. That the gods derived their self-esteem, their satisfaction from winning battles and being praised for it. In fact, the precise reason that you might want to bring your God into battle with you was because that God would be shamed, humiliated even, if you lost while they were present. And that means that maybe you can force or at least coerce your God into doing what you want and supporting your military agenda. And yet in this instance, this God says, not interested. In fact, I'm so not interested, maybe now is a time for a reset in the nation. See, it's interesting to me that all the way along, through all of the judges, always the catalyst for a new leader to emerge has been a battle. Even in the story of Deborah, who doesn't lead the military directly herself like the other judges, she's still the one who directs Barak to throw off the oppressive weight of Jabin and Sisera. But each time, all the way along, the battle, the fight, is always presented as a fight to throw off some kind of oppressive force that's bearing down on Israel, right? God raises up a judge to save them from that. And yet here, if we're reading closely at the start of chapter 4, we don't get any of that. The Philistines aren't attacking. It just says the Israelites went out to fight. In fact, my favorite translation of Samuel comes from a scholar named Robert Alter. And he renders this line, the Israelites sallied forth in battle against the Philistines. And I like that first because, nobody gets to use the word sallied forth these days. That is underused verbiage, in my opinion. But also, I think he's onto something here. He's doing this on purpose, right? Because the whole problem with this story is that they're not being oppressed. At least not here. They just simply want a fight. And God wants none of it this time. Even if that means this God looks like a loser. This is a pretty important moment in Hebrew history. The realization that God is willing to lose when that's the better choice. I think even here in this story, amidst all of the violence that we've seen in this series, we are also beginning to see the way back to God. that God is not our warrior. God is not interested in our wars. God takes no joy in our violence. And yes, of course, the violence of humanity begets more violence, and God is always on the side of the oppressed. But here we see that God is not interested in ruthless aggression, even when that aggression comes from God's own chosen people. In fact, God would rather lose and look the fool than prop up our endless pursuits of war. And that is something that every one of us, Christian or Hebrew, pacifist or not, should learn to take to heart. Because that simple realization that God is willing to lose for the sake of love, that is the beginning of the way that will culminate in the place where sins are finally forgiven for good. And Jesus shows us just how deep God's commitment to peace and mercy can really be. See, once you and I confront the fact that we cannot conscript God to our wars, I'm convinced that slowly what happens is that we will be conscripted to God's peace. And once we realize that God can't be carried around in our back pocket to support our agenda for what we want, maybe then we can slowly get on the path of participating in God's kingdom here on the earth, all around us, even today.